of the webinar for today. Today we have convened this webinar to discuss regional approach to stability in Afghanistan. As most of us are aware that the very swiftly changing situation in Afghanistan has thrown a lot of surprises and a lot of challenges, not only for the international community and the people of Afghanistan, but also for the countries of the region. The rather ominous exit of the foreign forces from Afghanistan and the rather swift takeover of Kabul by the Taliban has taken the world by a surprise. While European countries are bracing themselves for an influx of Afghan refugees on their shores, the regional countries have no option but to work together for the humanitarian cause, because there is a humanitarian tragedy in Afghanistan as we speak. It's not only the human rights of the people, it's also the livelihoods and also the rights of the vulnerable groups within Afghanistan. So it's all these burning questions for which there is a very strong need of regional collaboration. Regional collaboration is essential because we as countries neighboring Afghanistan don't have options. We have to work together to make peace and stability sustainable in Afghanistan. That is why we have gathered this eminent gathering of our panelists today from various parts of the world and the regional countries, so that we could discuss all these very pertinent burning issues with regard to Afghanistan. So the first speaker today that I would like to invite to speak on this important subject is Professor Wong Zhun, who is a research professor of international studies at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences and is currently the director of the Security Studies program at the SASS Institute of China Studies. He received his PhD in international politics from the Shanghai International Studies University. Professor Wong is the author of, most recently, a new theory on global war and terrorism. Let me also say that all of the panelists here have very rich profiles, but because of for the sake of brevity, I have restricted them to a few bullet points. With that, I pass the mic on to you, Professor Wong Zhun.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my great honor to share my ideas on this topic. I think it's a very interesting and it's very important and also very timely discussion on this topic, because we are all very concerned about it. I think to understand China's policy on Afghanistan, we have to answer two more other questions. First is, what are the China's main concerns in Afghanistan? And then what are the China's interests in Afghanistan? So let me answer the first questions. What are China's main concerns in Afghanistan? I think there's four main concerns for China. The first is that China's first concern is about the trans-border terrorist activity in Afghanistan. So as we all know that the ETIM for China, the ETIM, which is a separatist group from China's Xinjiang, and has very been active in Afghanistan. They have connections with Al-Qaeda and other global jihadist groups, and has always trying to infiltrate in Xinjiang. So I think this is the main concern, first concern of China. Second is whether Afghanistan can establish a truly inclusive government to stabilize its domestic political situations and to avoid new civil wars or other kind of virulent conflict. The third concern is whether the new Taliban regime, I mean the new Taliban, because it compared with 20 years ago, will adopt an open, moderate, rational policy in the future to protect the basic human rights for women, ethnic minorities, and political opposition groups, not to trigger another new international crisis. The third concern for China, I think, is whether there will be a large-scale humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. For example, the refugees, the pandemic, and also the famine and other chaos. Because all these issues will have important effect on its domestic and the regional stability. So we think it's very important. It's not just for Afghanistan, but also for the regional security and stability. Then, what is China's interest? Not at the present, I think up to now, China didn't make it clear what China's main interest there. But I think from my own understanding, I think there's something need to concern or need to be deserved to watch. The first is that counter-terrorism is one of China's main interest in Afghanistan. I think China has two expectations for in Afghanistan. The first is that the new government need to crack it down all the trans-border terrorist organizations in its territory, not just ETIM. ETM, of course, ETM is more directly connected with China's security, but also other international trans-border jihadist groups. I think this is one of China's main concern and also China's interest. And the second is that to prevent its territory from continue being as the shelter or hub for the global terrorist groups. I mean, in the future, not just a crackdown, but in the future, has to keep it, far from these trans-border jihadist groups. The second is the regional security. I think China gave much more importance on the regional security because Afghanistan has a lot of influence on its neighboring countries, including Pakistan, China, and other Central Asia countries. I think for this, we have two meanings. First, our dimensions. The first is Afghanistan is a neighboring country of China. In China, we have a very famous Chinese thing. You can choose your friend, but you cannot choose your neighbors because you cannot move it away. And second is that China has a lot of economic cooperation with other neighboring countries. So I don't want to mention one by one because including Pakistan, we have a lot of program, including and also other Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. We have a lot of cooperation, economic and political and border security, other things. I think this is very important. And the third thing is that we don't hope or we don't want to see that Afghanistan's civil conflicts or civil wars spill over to other neighboring countries, including the refugee crisis. I think this is very important. In China, we call this is a strategic environment, strategic regional environment to keep the security or to keep the stable of the strategic environment is very important for China. As I think this is the second dimension. The third one is the political and economic cooperations. By the end of 2017, China had accumulative invested $400 million as a direct investment in Afghanistan. And in 2020, the last year, China-Afghanistan's bilateral trade volume was about $550 million, with China export to Afghanistan of $500 million and imports from Afghanistan of $50 million. So obviously, compared with other neighboring countries, this investment and the bilateral relations, I mean, the bilateral trade is not very big. It's very limited. I mean, but maybe it implies that we have more potential, but no, it's not very big. But anyway, we are expecting that if the civil war can be solved, if Afghanistan can be stable very soon and begin and start its national, we call them national building or nation buildings, and maybe we can continue or expand the political and economic cooperation in a relatively peaceful and stable environment in the coming years. I think this is what we are looking for. This is China's, I think, the three dimensions of China's main interest in Afghanistan from my own understandings. Then what is China's approach or China's policy? frankly speaking, there are a lot of disputes in China. I mean, for the public, they have a lot of dispute on what kind of role China should play in Afghanistan. Basically, there are three kind of points on China's policy to Pakistan. The first one believes that after the United States and the NATO withdraw from Afghanistan, China should make the full use of this opportunity to actively participate in Afghanistan affairs and play a bigger role. This is some people, they think so. The second view is that the situation in Afghanistan is far from stable and clear. And China does not have much interest in Afghanistan, as I said just now. And as a developing country at present, China should not interfere too much and prematurely in Afghanistan. As far as I know, that most of my friends know they hold this view at present. The third view is that China should play a kind of role cautiously within its capacity. This is the current view of some scholars, including myself, which to play some kind of role because it's our neighbors. We have to do something, but we have to do something based on our capability and our interest. This is some scholars popular hold this view. As for now, China's policy in Afghanistan, I think has three main levels or three dimensions. The first, as I said, is about the political stability of Afghanistan. China is supporting Afghanistan to establish a truly inclusive coalition government and keeping Afghanistan to achieve political stability and reconciliation through bilateral and multilateral channels. And China will actively communicate with all parties not to exclude any party, because we don't have any bias or prejudice on any party. We think they should be the master of their land. They should be equal. They should have the equal rights to build their own country. The second is about the counter-terrorism in Afghanistan. China has already expressed its concern and position through various channels to urge the regime, the Afghanistan government to take measures to crack down the international terrorist organizations, including the ETIM, because the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, as I said just now, the separatist groups from Xinjiang, and no longer provide, I mean, the Afghan government, new government should no longer provide shelters for those transport terrorist groups. For the future corporations, I think our cooperation will be based on the bilateral or multilateral regimes, such as SCO and other neighboring foreign ministry regimes, something like that. I think there will be some new framework will be created in the future to in order to solve the different kinds of problem, because the counter-terror is a very complicated one. If I have time, I will explain later. The third is humanitarian assistance. On the one hand, China has already provided 200 million Chinese dollars emergency supplies to Afghanistan, such as food, winter supplies, and coronavirus vaccines and medicines. And I think it will do more if necessary in the future. On the other hand, I think China will cooperate with other countries, including other neighboring countries, to cooperate to aid Afghanistan on the humanitarian assistance, and including the efforts to lift sanctions on Afghanistan, because Taliban and the Afghanistan government was still, under the sanction from the other countries and also UN. The fourth, in terms of economic constructions, I think maybe it's too early to talk about the economic cooperation. But if the situation changes better, I think China would like to invite Afghanistan to join the Belt and Road initiatives and to cooperate in the fields of agriculture, infrastructure, etc. I think it always depends on Afghanistan's the future development and stability, especially stability and security. In general, China's policy will not target any country, and China's interest and policy actually consist with other neighboring countries, including some Western countries. For example, in the terms of maintaining stability and counter-terror and cooperation, I mean the economic cooperation, etc. But however, China will respect the sovereignty and independence of Afghanistan. This is the heritage and the tradition of China's foreign policy. And at the same time, will insist on Afghan's domain and Afghan's own. I think this is the essence of China's policy, because we think they should be the owner and the master of their own land. But we will try something to help them. I think this is the essence of China's foreign policy. Okay, Chair, I will stop here and looking forward to comments and questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Wong Zhun. I think you've set the stage for the discussion that will follow your comments. I think you've very rightly enumerated the various policy concerns and the various policy approaches that China adopts with regard to Afghanistan. You listed the primary concern as counter-terrorism, and then humanitarian concerns. And then also China would like to have economic cooperation, further economic cooperation with Afghanistan if there is regional stability and if there is stability within Afghanistan. With that,
You're on
hello.
mute, Mr. Arish.
I'm sorry, I think I got disconnected for a short while. I'm so sorry for that. I hope you guys can.
You're audible.
Okay.
Arish, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, so my second speaker for today's session is Dr. ZAHID SHAHAB AHMED. Dr. Ahmed is a research fellow and faculty of Arts and Education at the Department of Alfred Deakin Institute, Melbourne, Australia. His research is focused on peace and security in South Asia and the Middle East. Dr. Ahmed has published and presented papers on a wide range of issues and has received his PhD in Political and International Studies from the University of New England in Australia. Dr. Ahmed is going to talk to us about CARS and Russia's approach to stability in Afghanistan. With that, over to you, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arish, and thanks to the Institute of Regional Studies for the invitation. I think the event is very timely. Similar to as Professor Wong, started with key concerns of China in relation to these new developments in Afghanistan. I'll focus first also on some key issues that CARS and Russia are interested in with reference to Afghanistan. And then I'll focus on what kind of regional options they are looking at, or in terms of also regional organizations or other kind of multilateral opportunities, and what kind of possibilities are there for Central Asian republics and Russia, considering there are many different kinds of mechanisms available. So in terms of Russia and the Central Asian republics, they have shared concerns in relation to the spillover of extremism and terrorism from Afghanistan. And this interest is nothing new. They have for the past 2 decades this concern, and these concerns have increased with the activities of Islamic State, Khorasan especially. If you look at reports coming from Central Asia and Russia, Islamic State has been successful in recruiting from these countries towards the war in Syria. Many returned, and these countries have, imprisoned those fighters, similar to the case of, what is happening to one of the girls who went from England to Syria. So they have these concerns with reference to Afghanistan. Other mutual concern Russia and Central Asian republics have is with regard to drug trafficking. And especially in the past 2 decades, the production of drugs or narcotics increased a lot. in Afghanistan, and by virtue of that, the number of drug addicts also in Russia and Central Asian republics increased. In fact, also in Pakistan and Iran. So this is kind of like a shared non-traditional security threat you can call that all these neighboring countries have. And I remember President Putin, many years back, he called this narco war on Russia and blamed directly the NATO troops for being involved in this. So in terms of non-traditional security, again, Russia and Central Asian republics have denied hosting the Afghan refugees. And by saying that terrorists might enter their countries under the guise of refugees. So they have a very rigid policy on this. They're not going to change this. So they see the refugee issue as a big challenge, which is similar. Securitization of refugees, again, is nothing new to just Central Asia and Russia, but they have their own concerns and experiences. In terms of the US-Taliban peace deal, all these countries, Russia and Central Asian republics, they all supported it, especially Russia hosted peace delegations in Moscow because of its own interest in seeing the US troops leave its neighborhood. And although, historically, Central Asian republics also are close to the US since the end of the Cold War, they were not very much interested in that aspect in terms of the US troops leaving, but they fully supported the US-Taliban peace deal in many ways. And as the Central Asian republics are landlocked like Afghanistan, they are very much interested in peace and stability in Afghanistan to benefit from China's Belt and Road Initiative. So if we look at their geographical status, Uzbekistan is double landlocked. There are only 2 double landlocked countries in the world, and Uzbekistan is one. So they're very much interested in these developments in Afghanistan, and they want to engage as well for ethnic reasons and for geo-economic and geopolitical reasons. And Central Asian republics, also like other states, are encouraging an inclusive government in Afghanistan. So as I mentioned, ethnic reasons. So for example, there is a significant Tajik population in Afghanistan. So for Tajikistan, that's a very important issue. For Uzbekistan, the issue of Uzbeks is very important. And recently we have heard of these statements coming from Iran as well. They are very much interested in Hazaras having some role in the new setup, which is led by the Taliban. So of course, there is this dynamic as well. And if we look at the interim setup, which has been created by the Taliban, by no means it's inclusive. There are only 3 non-Pashtuns in there. If I'm correct, there are 2 Tajiks and 1 Uzbeks, and the rest of the 30 are Pashtuns. And on this issue, all countries, Pakistan is trying its own approach, but Central Asian republics have been very concerned, especially Tajikistan has been very vocal about it. Tajik president recently said, quote unquote, that we see that the Taliban, contrary to their statements, are intent on creating an Islamic emirate alien to the modern world order, and the government they have formed consists only of their members. So the concerns are very clear that, why they want to engage and how part, I'll talk about that, how they want to engage. And at the same time, we have to see that Central Asian republics and Russia can engage with, and they want to engage with today's Afghanistan, which is led by the Taliban. So the Taliban has also shown that they have changed, and they want to demonstrate that they have changed. So there is an opportunity in this regard. At least diplomatically, the Taliban, they have links even with their erstwhile adversaries like Iran and Russia. So there is this opportunity in that regard. And the Taliban, they also want more recognition than they enjoyed in the 1990s, when there was Islamic Emirate from 1996 to 2001. They want more countries to recognize them. And in this regard, they are relying a lot on at least Afghanistan's neighbors to first recognize their government. And in this regard, they are also interested in engaging with the Central Asian republics and also with Russia. So if we look at, historically, I think history is important here. That after the Taliban reached, for example, especially the Central Asian borders in the late 1990s, The governments of Central Asian republics, they were very much concerned, if not fully panicked. So I'm talking about Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan in this regard especially. And only Turkmenistan, with its official policy of neutrality, managed to reach an understanding with the Taliban back then. And to understand the Central Asian republics also have a conflictual history with the Taliban. That's important. We know that, you know, the Taliban had conflictual history with Iran and other actors, but I think the Central Asian case is also very important because three of the most prominent Central Asian republics, they were supporting the Northern Alliance against the Islamic Emirate. So I'm talking about here Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. They were clearly supporting the Northern Alliance. And after the United States and its allies started military operations in Afghanistan post 9/11, you know, many of those threats that the Central Asian republics faced, they sort of eliminated because Northern Alliance became a key actor again in bringing down the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So I think these are important historical aspects. And as far as Russia's interest is concerned, because I'm only given 10 minutes and I'm very conscious of the time. So perhaps I'll leave out many issues that can be addressed in the Q&A. As far as Russia is concerned, Russia's, you know, I've already talked about its first concern. First concern was to see the US or the international troops withdraw from Afghanistan. Now, just like other regional actors, Russia and Central Asian republics are also concerned about the spillover in the shape of extremism and terrorism. Pakistan, China, Professor Wong talked about East Turkestan Islamic movement. Pakistan has been concerned about Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, and Islamic State is a major threat for Iran and Central Asian republics and also Russia. So they all have these mutual concerns. So now I'll quickly actually talk about some options. So of course there is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but another important setup or multilateral mechanism is Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, which is led by Russia, but Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan are its members. They organize joint military exercises. There was one, I think, just a few weeks ago, and they are all very keen on using that going forward with reference to regional security in Afghanistan. Now, I'll first talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and what kind of potential it has for engagement in Afghanistan. So Shanghai, the SCO summit recently happened, as we all may know, and there President Xi Jinping of China said that all SCO members should facilitate a smooth transition in Afghanistan. And pretty much everyone agreed to it. And SCO perhaps is the most viable forum because Iran has also recently become a full member. India and Pakistan were already full members. So most of the regional actors that we can consider have a full membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So in this regard, it's interesting, but then there are tricky aspects. Although the SCO has these, it focuses on the so-called three evils that they call radicalization, extremism, and terrorism. That also involves intelligence sharing. And now with India and Pakistan as full members, you know, there is always this concern that how that is going to happen because, you know, India and Pakistan have a long history of, for example, in smaller organizations like SARC, you know, we know what has happened in SARC as well. So there are these concerns, and also because of India's own differences with China, India did not participate in the joint military exercises through SCO, which is called Kavkaz last year in Russia. So there are already some troubles that the SCO is facing, but in my opinion, India has no other better opportunity than the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to continue its engagement. So considering that, there is some hope. So when it comes to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, I think this is very, again, an interesting sort of forum through which Central Asian republics and Russia want to engage with Afghanistan, and they have already expressed interest in this. Tajik President Rahmon said that And they are equally favoring the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and this setup, which is CSTO. So he said that we believe that the SCO and the CSTO states could use their full potential to influence the intra-Afghan, peace process and so on. But again, both have one weakness. Afghanistan is not a full member in either of them. So they have to, going forward, they have to create some space for the new government in Afghanistan. So to sum up, in conclusion, I would say that there are both geoeconomic and geopolitical reasons due to which Central Asian republics and Russia, they want to engage with Afghanistan or especially with the Taliban. And they have shared non-traditional security concerns with reference to extremism and terrorism and with the reference to refugees as well. And like other regional states, like Pakistan, like China, and of course, unlike the US and European states, Russia and Central Asia cannot sit on the sidelines and ignore these developments in Afghanistan. And they have already said that they would engage with the Taliban. And it's only a matter of time. We will see to a degree to which the Taliban are willing to be flexible enough to address the concerns of Central Asian republics and Russia and others to keep their engagement alive with them. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ahmed. It was, yes, of course, like other regional countries, the Central Asian republics and Russia as well are concerned about the spillover of extremist elements from Afghanistan, as well as the influx of refugees from Afghanistan. And as you rightly pointed out, sir, that they, unlike the European countries and the US, the neighbors of Afghanistan don't have the luxury to sit on the fence and weather the storm. So we are in it, and we all have to do something collectively to deal with the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and the crisis of stability in Afghanistan. Our next speaker for the session. Our next speaker for the session is Dr. Absal Ashraf. But before I invite him to speak, as I can see that we also have Professor Vadim Kosyulin from Russia here with us, since Professor Ahmed also talked about the approach of the Central Asian republics and Russia toward Afghanistan. So if briefly, Professor Kosyulin, who is a consultant and a global and regional security new ideas for Russia program, if he could also briefly share his thoughts on the subject at hand that Professor Ahmed was discussing.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk. I fully support what was said by my predecessor, Dr. Ahmed, and I can only add that Russian authorities established certain contacts with Taliban quite in advance before the recent developments. And today we see that it was a quite wise step, though it was widely criticized by United States and by Western countries. Nowadays, we have stable relations with different figures in Afghanistan. We have our embassy there, and the ambassador is in permanent contact with Taliban. The issue of Afghanistan has been discussed with our neighbors, with Central Asian republics, and with China. Of course, the situation is not clear at the moment, and the policy is not determined, as we can understand. Our Chinese colleague described the Chinese policy. I guess that it's more or less close to what Russian government feels in respect of China, or sorry, in respect of Afghanistan, and the vision of future of Afghanistan is more or less the same. I also support the idea that one of key problems Russia faces in respect of Afghanistan is drug trafficking. It's a huge problem for our population, for young people, and hopefully that's one of key issues in relation of Taliban. Hopefully Taliban will be capable, as they promised, to fight against drug trafficking. I also see one major problem which will probably face in near future. As far as United States withdrew from Afghanistan, Western countries will lose their interest in the Afghani problems soon, as it happened to Libya, to Syria, to Iraq. So Afghan population might become people who are forgotten, and their problems will disappear from mass media and from, as we call it, international radars. So regional countries will have to solve it, and I guess that it was quite right that Mr. Ahmed mentioned Shanghai Organization as probably the right forum for discussing the issue of Afghanistan and taking certain decisions. But as far as we also globally see the competition between China and United States and Russia, Afghanistan might become the center of this competition, the ground for economic, political, and other forms of open or covered conflicts. And we probably should think about it and try to avoid this kind of developments. So I probably will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kosulin. It was you've pretty much summed up Russian approach to the problem in Afghanistan. It is, as you said, it is very much similar to the Chinese concerns and the Chinese policy approach. And as you've said, that the Russian government establishing contact with the Taliban government has proved to be the right decision at the right time. Now we'll move to our next speaker of today's session, that is Dr. Absal Ashraf. Dr. Absal Ashraf is a visiting fellow at the Center for Conflict, Security and Terrorism at the University of Nottingham in the UK. He was a senior officer in the Royal Air Force and worked as a counter-terrorism and counterinsurgency strategist for the US Commanding General and the US Ambassador in Iraq, as well as the head of the political military section in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Dr. Ashraf holds a PhD in Al-Qaeda's ideology and is a senior government advisor. Dr. Ashraf is going to talk about the need for regional consensus on Afghanistan. Over to you, Dr. Ashraf.
Good morning and assalamu alaikum to everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this fascinating and very timely discussion. I've been asked to talk about, obviously, the regional issues. Some of them, of course, have been very ably already addressed by the three speakers. I just want to give this discussion a bit of context. I think what we need to appreciate is that we're having this discussion on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan. And what does that really mean? And that is that the idea of geopolitics, we must understand geopolitics before we can actually look at regional politics. And the idea of geopolitics has cursed Afghanistan more so than many other nations in being at the crossroads of many, if you like, roots and many strategic concerns for the great powers. You're all aware, of course, of the great game with the British and the Russians. We obviously are well aware of the Russian invasion in the 1980s or 79 and continuing into the 1980s. And we all know, I think, particularly in this forum, the connection between that event in the 1980s to the events of today. And the point I want to make here really is that the approach of geopolitics, which has been dominated by Western thinking, has really come to a crossroads. Many people recognize this as no longer being effective or relevant. It's failing in its objective. However, the institutions, the leadership in the Western world hasn't really had time to adjust. There is a very interesting, if you like, pushback. For the first time in my lifetime, we have Western politicians, political leaders, even former heads of Secretary Generals of NATO, criticizing and blaming the President of the United States of America, both Biden and Trump, rather than actually confronting what I believe to be the central issue, and that is a failure of political and military strategy in Afghanistan, which has led not to just this collapse, but to the deaths of, depending on the figures you read, 150,000 or fewer innocent civilians. Those are being written out of the equation in international relations about states and civilians sadly continue not to matter very much. So what we have here is a geopolitical environment which I personally believe has consistently failed, and we're talking about since the Vietnam War, to deliver military successes and sustainable political success. And so the reason for me emphasizing this is that as we look forward to a period of disengagement, or at least hopefully public disengagement, overt disengagement from the West, what other regional players, and China is really important in this, Russia also to a large extent, don't fall into the trap of Western interventionism and make the same mistakes in a different way. What I think we need to understand that 9/11, which led to this invasion, really introduced a new player into the international sphere, and that is what we would call as a non-government violence actor, non-state violent actor, terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda in this case. And these groups, excuse me, these groups represent the non-state actors. And I think we do need to understand their chemistry, particularly in the case of the Taliban, who are in many ways a hybrid of that sort of organization. So what do we really want to achieve before we decide how we're going to achieve it, what we want to achieve? And I think all regional players would agree on one clear objective, and that is peace and prosperity. That is what we want to achieve. And if you ask the West, that is exactly what they wanted to achieve. The problem, of course, is their method, the means by which they wanted to achieve those ends was through the introduction of democracy and human rights, as they put it. What I think needs to be understood, if anything, that we can learn from the last 20 years or more of war, is that stability, more than democracy, provides that ability. And indeed, as far as human rights are concerned, if we look at basic human rights, the right to life, the right to eat and have shelter, I think the Chinese example is a fantastic one where, okay, there isn't the sort of high level human rights of self-expression that the West champions, but they have managed to uplift the billions of people out of poverty and give them the right to life. And the irony of Afghanistan is that those hundreds of thousands of people that have died to give the women the right to go to school, which I think is an absolutely essential right. No way would I criticize that. Half of those have been women and girls that have died in the process. So let us get a hierarchy sorted out of human rights and start delivering the basic rights, the rights to life and the rights to subsistence. And throughout the time of the occupation of Afghanistan by foreign forces in the last 20 years, the typical Afghani family was living on $3 a day, and that is not sustainable in terms of human rights. So anyway, that's, I think, the broad background. Where do regional politics fit in? Well, we've heard a fantastic exposition, a very detailed and broad exposition by Professor Wang, and I don't have a great deal to add to it except to encourage China, I hope, to continue its distinctive approach to geopolitics, and that's non-interference approach, and keeping its involvement on purely economic grounds, and those I hope will be on non-exploitative economic grounds, where there's a win-win situation for both parties. That's the way economics works best, and that's what I would encourage China to pursue. And the same thing for Russia. The Russian influence, I think, again, Mr. ZAHID Ahmed has explained in some detail how that can be brought to bear, particularly through the former Russian states or the Soviet states, Tajikistan in particular. Now, I'm not an expert in this area, but I have been recently to Kyrgyzstan and to some degree to Uzbekistan, and I've done some work on extremism and terrorist groups, speaking to former terrorists or actually existing terrorists in prison and so on. And I think one of the things that I found, particularly in contributing to a number of conferences there, conferences on the relationship between the state secularism and security, state secularism and security, that in those states, like in many other states in the region, Pakistan included, there is a difference between the state's policy and the religious organizations. Kyrgyzstan, for example, well, all former Soviet states have something called the Muftiat, something that was started by, I think, Princess Alexandra back in over 150 years ago. The Muftiat, which is sort of like a papal organization for the Muslims in the state. And the Muftiat is actually run or is dominated by the Tablighi Jamaat from Pakistan in Kyrgyzstan at the moment. And so you have a great deal of scope for foreign influence, not necessarily benign, and certainly not necessarily aligned to that of the state. And we have seen in the past, those of you who have looked into terrorism, how Central Asian Islamist extremist organizations, terrorist organizations, have influenced the organizations in Afghanistan as well. So there is an area of concern there. By the way, I use the term Islamist in the French sense to mean political Islam as opposed to Islam as a religion, and that's really important to take on board. So the two countries, well, India, I think, and then I'll go on to Pakistan and Iran. India has been seen by many Pakistanis, understandably, as a spoiler in the region, and of course they've lost their traction. But India did have one plausible justification, or minor plausible justification, for its involvement, and that was the involvement to avoid extremism, because there is a link between the jihadi extremists in Pakistan, who have been used, sadly, by the state in the Kashmiri crisis, and other so-called jihadi movements, including the Taliban in Afghanistan. And one of the things that I think Pakistan and Iran need to do is to engage with the Taliban and help them transform into a responsible organization, and help them shed this a jihadi interpretation of religion, which I think they're struggling with. And so what do I mean by that? Well, I think that if you look at the Taliban coming in, they've done some fairly interesting things that show to me, at least, that they have been trying their best to adopt an Islamic view of things. The amnesty, as many of you who are Muslims will recognize, comes from the practice of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When he came into Mecca, he gave an amnesty to everybody who had, in many cases, not just inflicted great pain and torture on him, but had killed even his own daughter. That's the level of mercy that was shown. Indeed, if you look at the recitation of the Quran, when the Taliban did their famous, if you like, arrival speech or conference in the presidential palace, that verse, that chapter was specifically chosen. There are many other things that they have tried to do, but they're failing. They're failing miserably because, in their own words, they need to teach their own people discipline. And irony of ironies, what they have failed to do, as indeed most these extremist movements have failed to do, is to teach their own people religion. The tarbiyat, the training of their own people, is what is lacking. And this becomes an increasingly complex and very serious situation when you have in Afghanistan this melding together of religion and culture, Pashtunwali, the concept of badal and so on, which has a peculiar way in the Pashtun culture of almost eclipsing religion. You bring these two fairly violent things or violent interpretations together, or violent interpretation of religion that has been mobilized in the last century or so, then you have the makings of a potentially disastrous situation. So I want to just end on a note of extreme caution. Some might even describe it as pessimism. Unless the Taliban have some good sense and a great deal of support and a great deal of divine guidance, I personally am not optimistic. That I believe that they will fail to achieve their aspirations for the reasons I've said, because they have taught their people one interpretation which is no longer relevant to running a state. And the other thing that I think that we will have a problem with is that there will be infightings within, and there are signs of that already within the organization. So, and to end with, in the last few seconds, what sort of policy should regional countries adopt? Well, I think there's a sort of policy that's been talked about, certainly from China and to some degree from Russia, is to wait and see. And I think it's, to have an interactive policy with the Taliban and reward them for good behavior and not encourage, if you like, what we might collectively see as bad behavior. I think what we need to do also is to agree, I hope, in the region that stability is the key to peace and prosperity, not just for the Afghan people who desperately deserve it, but it is for the region as a whole. And everything that must be done must encourage stability, not instability. So the sort of likely outcomes are that there will be people across the world who will want to use covert action to do what is being done for the last century and encourage opposition movements and so on. And that will only increase instability. The second thing I think is that must separate policy towards the state, the government, the Taliban regime, and policy towards the people. The people are in desperate need for humanitarian assistance, other assistance in terms of education and whatever is needed for the society to develop, for the people to have a meaningful existence. And I think Iran and Pakistan especially are extremely well placed to interject in those regions, but always keeping a separation between whatever the relationships might go up and down between the Taliban government and the state of Pakistan, the state of Iran, but always making it clear that we will not let the people down. We will provide for them to the best extent possible. And I think that's the best advice I can offer. I'm sure that people listening to it will be able to offer much better advice And I hope we can learn from each other in that regard. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashraf. I think you've covered so much ground in such a short period of time. It's amazing. Not only have you put it in the context of geopolitics and terrorism and counter-terrorism, but also I think I really enjoyed your comment about the misplaced priorities of the past 20 years in Afghanistan, and your suggestion about having a hierarchical approach to human rights. I think these are some very fascinating ideas for us to think more about, and for everybody to think more about. Thank you so much for your very enlightening comments. Now I'll move on to our last speaker of today's webinar, Dr. Salma Malik, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. She specializes in the areas of conflict and security studies and South Asian affairs. She holds a PhD in Defense and Strategic Studies from Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad, besides fellowships and certifications from abroad. Dr. Malik is going to talk about Pakistan's approach to stability in Afghanistan. Over to you, Dr. Malik.
Thank you so much, Ashraf. It's been a wonderful opportunity listening to such illustrious speakers, and I hope I do a little bit of justice in saying what I need to say. But I'm most grateful to IRS for giving me this opportunity. And I think looking at Afghanistan from a regional lens is extremely important, given the fact that anything that happens to Afghanistan in this increasingly interdependent world is not only going to directly impact the next door neighbors, mainly Pakistan, it is also going to affect the neighbors that do not share a boundary with Afghanistan. And the more we talk about it, the less that is. Again, as I said, that in this interdependent world, what we need to see is that it is not only a geographic proximity or geographic connectivity with another country, but the fact that security as an overarching concept is extremely intertwined and linked with various things. When we look at Afghanistan, Pakistan and Afghanistan, for the US ease of convenience, had also been termed into an AFPAC during Holbrooke-Obama's formula of looking at Afghan security post 9/11. But, and that was a point that Pakistan had major objections on, primarily for the fact that looking at it from a security lens and from a war zone, Pakistan was not equal to Afghanistan as a war zone, and Pakistan was not part of a war zone. So Pakistan had very, very justified reasons as to why we objected to America terming it Pakistan and Afghanistan as a common area. However, given the old history both the countries share, even if we go pre-colonial or from the ethnic history of this area, there has been a lot of cross-border movement. And people from Afghanistan are now even found as Suri tribes or this, whatever in Bangladesh as well. In Calcutta, there is a vibrant Afghan Suri community that lives there. You can go to any part of the world and you would find people who have moved from place to place. We have a vibrant Sikh community not only in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but also in Afghanistan. So this is the type of people-based interdependence that we have, where crossing of this national grid has been there pre-partition and a little bit less post-partition, because the nationhood formula was deeply authenticized and deeply entrenched in that time frame, but the people lived where they were. And as a result of it, if we look at Afghanistan from a humanitarian lens and look at how Pakistan wants to help Afghanistan in a regional formula, then I would say a couple of things. And number one, of course, is that what is happening in Afghanistan, if the region and the regional countries around Afghanistan, which also includes Central Asia or any of the Arab or non-Arab Middle Eastern countries, they do not understand the dynamics of Afghanistan and the humanitarian crisis that is coming up, unfortunately, it is going to have a massive spillover effect. And as many of the countries love to blame Pakistan for its alleged role in the bringing back or the Taliban 2.0, one needs to really understand and hammer this point home that the coming back of the Taliban was something that Pakistan had been telling the entire international community that engage with them, because at the end of the day they are the residents of this area, and they are going to be back here because you're not coming up with viable alternatives or strong alternatives which can provide a good governance. So the biggest implication that is going to be here, of course, in case of civil unrest in Afghanistan, is the humanitarian inflow into the various regional countries, including Pakistan, and mainly Pakistan, because Pakistan has already hosted a huge number of Afghan nationals, and it is going to keep on doing that despite any of our saying that we are not going to do it, we are going to be more stringent. But Pakistan is always, at the end of the day, whether it is a security related or a environment or climate related emergency in Afghanistan, eventually opened its border for the Afghan nationals, and they've come and sought refuge here. Another point that Dr. ZAHID Shahab was pointing out, of course, is the factor of security of the Afghan nationals who enter Pakistan as to how they're going to affect the security dynamics. And that is another very important question that needs to be addressed here, because Pakistan and Afghanistan's security over these 20 plus years has been so deeply interlinked that despite the border fencing and all the security measures Pakistan has tried to take over these years, there will be and there do remain gray areas which are yet to be resolved. One more factor that from Afghanistan's side on the people-centric approach when we're looking at security is that, God forbid, in case there are no financial assistance provided to Afghanistan, the illicit economy again is going to thrive. And if it is going to thrive, the border zones are the most vulnerable areas when it comes to the thriving of the illicit economy or the trade and trafficking of the goods and services that are part and parcel of this illicit trade. And that makes, again, Pakistan-Afghanistan border zones very vulnerable. Despite Pakistan's mainstreaming of the FATA, inclusion of the FATA into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, despite our border fencing, this people-centric movement via Afghanistan is something that Pakistan, in case of humanitarian crisis, may not be able to fully check or ensure. And of course, we also have this fear that if the Afghan nationals come to Pakistan as refugees, in the guise of those refugees or under the cover of those refugees, we might also have militant elements that would come back to Pakistan or that would come to Pakistan and create problems for both the countries and unfortunately then affect the security profile of the entire region. Pakistan is already in this eye of the storm, and that is going to become a worse situation in the days to come. The third aspect that I'm going to highlight on the humanitarian front when it comes, especially on the Pakistan area, is that Pakistan is trying time and hard to assure to the world community and also negotiate with the Taliban for providing better civil society environment, as well as ensuring women rights and doing several things that it had promised when the Taliban regime was at that time residing in Doha and they were negotiating with the Western powers. Now, the issue is that the Taliban are, on the face of it, trying to do as best as they can. Apparently, from the statements they're given or from the photo ops that they're using to convince the international community, we have seen women marching on the road, and we have also seen that they have been fired upon. But the fact is that if you're trying to find some silver line to the cloud, that at the end of the day, at least the Taliban are being open to women coming out on the roads and talking about themselves. Now, what happens in the days to come is anybody's guess, but we need to engage with the Taliban at a regional level, as many countries as possible. I'm not advocating a recognition of the Taliban, because there are a lot of steps that need to be covered legally as well as politically for the Taliban to get recognized as a legitimate government in Afghanistan. But the very fact is that if the regional countries led by Pakistan, because Pakistan has a lead role when it comes to Afghan issues, given our geographical proximity, given our historical linkages, also given our connection with the Taliban. So if it is a bad connection, let Pakistan use it as a positive connection. And if we use that connection as a positive connection, then we have a leverage in making the Taliban listen to several things that can have a course correction, in which women rights, children rights, not going for illicit trade, trafficking, poppy cultivation, and so many other things, and not also preventing an inclusivity in the governance system are the basic and the baseline, what would we say, priority areas that need to be there. In case the regional countries do not come together and they do not help the Afghan nationals, not only is it going to give a rise to civil unrest in Afghanistan, it is also going to give rise to, as I said initially, a flight of people from Afghanistan. And secondly, Afghanistan, the soil of Afghanistan, the land of Afghanistan is going to be again embroiled in a lot of conflict. The third thing that Pakistan needs to see from its lens, and that is something which is very obvious from the developments that are taking place since August 15th, is that despite the US physically leaving Afghanistan, now Pakistan is going to be made the flogging horse in this particular defeat of the US or the Western powers, when they did not understand the complex dynamics of Afghanistan, the complex dynamics of Afghan society, and for the failure of the corrupt regime in Afghanistan, who kept on only focusing on Pakistan to as a diversionary tactic. But what we actually need to see here is that now the land of Afghanistan is going to be used as a proxy front, not only by India, but also by the US against China and Pakistan, so that China's economic interest do not increase beyond a certain point and they keep on getting retarded, or at least they keep on getting checked. And that again is going to give rise to a lot of turmoil in this region, and Pakistan has to be prepared for it, because Afghanistan is going to have a very different take, or the Taliban regime in days to come are going to have a different take on that. And in case there is no one engaging the Taliban regime in any conversation or in any political dialogue, the entire flag would be on Pakistan. And on the economic front, or the geo-economic front more so, Pakistan is going to suffer a lot. And that is something that we need to ensure. And again, as I go back to my initial point, that where we objected to the notion of AFPAC, now the Afghanistan-Pakistan duo, along with China, is going to be a triad, which is going to be extremely problematic for Pakistan to handle. Because the US, the Western powers, and India is going to use these three cards maximum to hurt Pakistan. And Pakistan has to have a very strong way of overcoming these challenges, understanding these challenges, and seeing how we can override these problems in one capacity. Third aspect, of course, that we look at from Afghanistan's angle is the financial aspect. That in case the finances are not restored to the Taliban administration or to Afghanistan, what is going to happen? We cannot keep on relying on aid coming from friendly states for the Afghan nationals. We need to have a permanent sustaining formula for Afghanistan. And that again takes me back to my initial point of saying that in case the Taliban are sanctioned, in case the Taliban are castigated, they are pushed against the wall, there are economic sanctions against them, this is an open invitation and incentive for such regimes which are not recognized, which no one is negotiating with, which are considered to be pariah regimes, for them to flaunt the international order and for them to go to any type of illicit means to earn their livelihood. And then because they're not part of any positive international order, they have no fear of being further sanctioned. So in case there are no finances and there are more sanctions, that will take Afghans to an unfortunately illicit direction of gaining their finances. So we need to, from the Pakistan side, what can we do? What we are doing already, we are engaging with the regional actors, with countries that may understand the plight of Afghan nationals, and Pakistan has to up its game in making people understand, or making countries understand as to what is the situation going on in Afghanistan. Pakistan also needs to make the international community realize, and many of them do realize, but several of them are not willing to accept the fact that it were their failures of governance and their failure of understanding Afghanistan's complex dynamics, rather than Pakistan's involvement in changing the entire international order in Afghanistan, that these things have happened. So Pakistan has to up its diplomacy. And even if we have to make our envoys, special envoys in Afghanistan, work on the double, we need more people who have understanding of the complex Afghan dynamics. Go out, talk to people, go to international assemblies and tell people as to what is exactly happening in Afghanistan, what is going to happen. And Afghanistan is a very unique case study, which does not correspond directly with the democratic norms that the US or the Western powers are familiar with. They can talk as much as they want about the women issue that there are, but we also need to be very particular in explaining to the world that in Afghanistan, if a woman is wearing a headscarf, that does not affect her intellectualism, that does not affect her freedom. If that, in fact, as a matter of fact, provides her more liberty and freedom to move out in the open by just covering her head, that is a good enough notion. That is not imprisoning women in any type of a security prison or ideological prison. But if that affords them liberty of movement and freedom of earning livelihood, then so be it. We have to move very incrementally here. The Taliban are not here because of or because of Pakistan. The Taliban are here because of an agreement the US government signed with the Taliban in Doha, and a separate agreement that US administration signed with the Ghani government. And immediately after signing with the Ghani government, the US administration was campaigning totally negative about the Ghani government, that they are not going for inclusivity, they are not cooperating as per the Doha Accords. So we need to go back in history and we need to be more clear about what is happening there. From the Pakistan front, another aspect that we need to do is, as our Prime Minister has also made the trip to Central Asia, that we need to go talk to the countries which are engaging with the Taliban and which are also willing to listen to us, and also converse for an OSCE special summit if that really helps, but yet have the Muslim countries understand the dynamics of Afghanistan, and also have a bilateral dialogue with Iran, with Tehran, and make sure that they understand what our concerns there are. I mean, we do know that that New Delhi has already started a defamation campaign against Pakistan, and that is going to step up in the coming days. But we need to be very sure and clear about what we really need to do. We need to be a bit more transparent, not only in our explaining it to the international audience, but also explaining what we are saying to our domestic audience. A third factor is that we need to also be careful about the type of statements that are being issued from Pakistan. Not everyone has to speak. We need to be very careful, very close guarded about the type of statements that are emanating from the Pakistani front. Who is the spokesperson? Who is supposed to say what on Afghanistan? Who is the center of gravity? We really need to clarify it to the international community. Because unfortunately, we also see all type of Mad Hatter Western analysts who talk about the fact that, oh, if the civilian government is not being talked to, they're not the center of gravity. The center of gravity in Islamabad lies somewhere else. But this is actually a very precarious moment for Pakistan. In coming days, it's going to become worse. So Pakistan has to be very clear about what our future steps and direction is going to be. So on the political front, we need to be more active on the diplomacy. On the civil front, we need to be more transparent and bring our domestic audience on board. With Afghanistan, we need to be very clear. We are negotiating with the Taliban regime for the betterment of the Afghan nationals. We also need to have a very clear, precise, and well conveyed policy if the situation comes to a point that Afghan nationals are coming to Pakistan. We are already providing them with transit space. We are providing them with temporary transition period to stay in Pakistan, and then they are going abroad. Are we just going to keep it limited to that, or are we going to also allow more space for the Afghan nationals to come and reside in Pakistan? We need to work out on all of these nitty-gritties. The aid that we are providing to the Afghan nationals, we need to be very, very precise and clear about how we are doing it. The soft diplomacy needs to be projected to its maximum. I'm not saying that we need to capitalize on the plight of the Afghan nationals, but this is something that Pakistan has always done for Afghanistan. And the only thing that Pakistan gets in response, unfortunately, is a negative press. So we need to be very active when it comes to that. On the regional front, we need to negotiate dialogue with the regional countries, and we need to be the lead player in this. So for that reason, Pakistan has to be a very responsible, articulate, a state that knows what conversation needs to be brought out and what is the narrative going to be. Also, the fact that we don't need to react to every provocation that is emanating from the neighborhood or from the Western capitals. We need to be much more guarded about what we have to say. But the most important thing here is that Pakistan has to guard its safety and security. Pakistan need not repeat what it did in the 1980s, that we opened the space for anyone and everyone to walk around and totally challenge Pakistan and change Pakistan's security profile. On the geo-economic front, the biggest thing that we need to look at is the security of the CPEC routes and our relations with China. That is an aspect that is going to be severely brought under a lot of criticism and a lot of focus by the Western community. And this is the only chance Pakistan has to have an strong economic footprint. So we cannot compromise on our primary security, strategic, geo-economic parameters. So Pakistan has to be very, very prudent when it comes to Pakistan's relations with China and also Pakistan's performance on the CPEC. Already debate about CPEC slowing down and not bringing out the desired results is being talked about, but we need to be careful on that point. Last but not least, what I would say is that Pakistan has also been one of those countries that has stood by Afghanistan through thick and thin as a regional actor, as a country right next door to Afghanistan. Pakistan must play a lead role here, which we are already doing. But having said that, the first and foremost and primary thing that Pakistan needs to do is protect its own turf and territory and be careful about the narrative that is emanating from Pakistan and see to it that at any point our security is not compromised. Thank you very much, Arish.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malik. As you pointed out, that no matter how hard we try to shield ourselves from the influences emanating out of Afghanistan with fencing or other measures, it's going to be a people-centric approach that will bring stability, peace, and prosperity to the people of Afghanistan. That is the only thing that can save its neighbors from the negative implications of instability and any other negative implications that would be emanating out of Afghanistan. Thank you so much for your comments. We have a few questions. We move on to our Q&A. We have a few questions from the other participants. The first question is from my colleague Nabila Jafar, who has talked about the need for developing consensus at the regional level on charting out the major conditions for the acceptance of the new government of Taliban in Afghanistan. Some of our panelists have shed some light on regional approach to Afghanistan, but I think this question merits attention because we need to know, we talked about the bilateral approaches and bilateral concerns and interests of countries like China, Central Asian republics, and Russia. Zahid Saab talked about the SCO countries agreeing on a smooth transition in Afghanistan, but nothing more than that. So I would first request Dr. Zahid Shahab Ahmed, if he can respond to this, that whether there is a possibility of drafting major conditions, consensus conditions for the recognition of the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Over to you, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you very much. I think this is $1 million question, considering what's happening now in Afghanistan. As I shared, Central Asian republics, especially Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, they have, of course, their ethnic minorities in Afghanistan, Tajiks and Uzbeks. They are more interested in having more presence, more prominence for Tajiks and Uzbeks in the government. They are not happy with just 3 members in the 33-member interim government. Iran similarly wants Hazaras to have a greater role. Russia and others have talked about women's representation, I think. And Taliban, they haven't actually shown any sort of flexibility at this stage. So the conditions, I think the conditions are already clear, what each neighboring country or regional country wants. And I think they're not going to easily recognize the new setup unless some of their demands are met, because they understand that once they will recognize, they will lose that card that gives them some influence in Afghanistan. So everyone is very careful, and I think it's again wait and see kind of approach, but their desires are already clear what kind of new Afghanistan they want. From the Central Asian states perspective and also from Russia and others perspective, I've already talked about it.
Thank you. Professor Wong, Zhun, if you're around, I would like you to comment on this question as well. Chinese perspective on developing consensus for the recognition or setting terms and conditions for the recognition of the Taliban regime. What would be your take on this? So your mic, yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think when people are talking about the inclusive government, but they have different definition on this. Even in Taliban, maybe has different definitions on this. And other countries, I think each country will have their own definitions. And I'm not official from the MFA, so just my own understandings of these questions. I think this is very important. This is very important because everyone is concerned about this. And this question is also very important because it's not just about Afghanistan's political reconciliation and stable in the future, but also concerned by the international community. It's about the future recognition by the international community, I mean, to some extent in the future. So it's very interesting. But my own understanding is that when we talk about the inclusive government, there should be several things. The first is that they should include some former government officials, because they have a lot of connections with the Western world. This is very important for Taliban to keep the connection with the Western world. Another most important thing, I think perhaps the most important is that in Taliban government, they should include all the different ethnic groups. They should have the representatives there. As our panelists said just now, that for Uzbek, Tajik, and other ethnic groups, and also Halazas, etc. So each ethnic groups, each ethnic minority should have their representative in the government. So they should, represent and protect their interests. And this is also very important for the Taliban government to have a kind of consensus. I mean, political consensus and stable in the future. I think it's very important. And except besides this, besides the structure of the government, I think most important thing is what kind of policy Taliban will adopt in the future. Because when people concerned about the inclusive government, actually what they are concerning or what is the focus is the Taliban's future policy. Because some people believe that a different government structure will decide the future policy. So we're not just watching the structure of the government, but also watching what's the government, the policy, what kind of policy they will adopt in the future. I will stop here. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Professor Wong. But since you've listed the various conditions, Dr. Ahmed has also listed the various conditions that might be put forth by the regional countries for recognition of the Taliban regime. How do we go about its implementation? Like, will there be a need to call another SCO meeting to discuss this thing, or how should the regional countries proceed with this?
Okay,
Well, I think,
okay, Mr. Wong.
I think okay. Oh, okay. Please. Okay. I can wait later.
Mr. Wong and then Dr. Ahmed.
Okay, thank you. I think it's difficult, but I think you're right. This is very important. How to developing a consensus. I think at least in the neighboring countries, we have to set some conditions. That we have some conditions, and we have to explain the ideas through the different channels. At what kind of conditions, if the Taliban realize, then we'll do what will be the next of our policy. And what we have we have to make some clear definitions or make some clear points. What is the real inclusive government that we could accept? And also we communicate with this consensus with other countries. I mean, the Western world, the international communities. So then we something like to set up or to find a kind of preconditions or clear points to recognize, to support the Afghanistan new region, something like that. I think this will take some time, but I think we have to find some did some efforts to find a way to working for that. I think this is very important. You are very good suggestions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Do we need another SCO summit for this, or what kind of mechanism do we need to adopt?
Generally, intergovernmental organizations, the way they work is that there are heads of state level meetings. So the summit has already taken place. Most heads of states, they have shown interest in the SCO playing a bigger role. And the SCO already has the contact group on Afghanistan, and now it's a matter of actually other ministers actually engaging in the process. We don't need another summit because that will just slow down the process. So because the consensus is already there, I think the SCO needs to convene a foreign ministers level meeting or whoever used to be part of that Afghanistan contact group to see how these conditions can be prepared or consensus can be reached in relation to what every member state wants. But again, the SCO is going to leave out some important actors like Qatar. Qatar has been very important in the past, and the Western influence we cannot ignore. But I think what the consensus is going to do, or a regional approach, is that it will automatically reduce the likelihood of future proxy dynamics in Afghanistan. Afghanistan for long has suffered because of proxy dynamics. So if the government is not inclusive, and if any of the regional actors is not happy, there has already been talk of, for example, Iran reactivating Fatimiyun in Iran if they are not happy. The Fatimiyun brigade that fought in Syria, and many of its fighters are back in Afghanistan. And if Northern Alliance doesn't have much space, as Professor Wong also talked about, previous officials having at least some role in the new setup. I think that's important, because if that's not done, perhaps we are looking at another chaos in the shape of proxy wars in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed. The next question is from my colleague Humaira Iqbal. She's asking about does the greater Russian-Chinese cooperation in the economic sphere in Afghanistan, would this have risks for them to be pulled into new geopolitical disputes? Something that was also alluded to by Dr. Malik in her remarks, that America or India might want to sabotage Chinese investment through CPEC in this region through Afghanistan. So are there any such worries in Russia and China, in Beijing and Moscow? First, Professor Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is also a main concern by some scholars, because the world we are facing now is different with 20 years ago. And we now are facing a more serious, we call the power competition, or fierce geopolitics in Central Asia. So I think many people are worrying about that. But for China, I think maybe we do have some kind of risks on this, but from my own understanding that China's policy is not aimed, as I said, not aimed or targeted at any other countries, which because we believe Afghanistan is our neighbors. As I said, neighbors, you can't not choose your neighbors. So we do hope, and we really want to something to keep Afghanistan's stable, peaceful, and prosperity, and we'll try within our capacity. But the risks we could not cancel. But basically, at the present or up to now, we don't have such policy to deal with that. And our policy is not aimed to deal with the geopolitics. Our policy is mainly focused on the real concern to solve the regional crisis or to keep the Afghanistan stable and peaceful. But I think the risks are still there. But we'll try to avoid that, because if there was another kind of battlefield for the geopolitics, for the global geopolitics, I think it will be a disaster for many countries, for many people. I think that's a good thing. I think this is what I was trying to avoid it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Kosulin, would you want to comment on this?
Yes, it's quite interesting question, and I feel that it's unavoidable, as we see in the Pacific Ocean, the recent developments, construction of a new anti-Chinese organization between UK, Australia, and United States, even though it violates interests of European nations, and in particularly France. So we see that it's a strategic policy of the United States to to prevent fast development of China with different means, but primarily by military means. And Afghanistan might become such a ground for this kind of big game, as it used to be several times in the past. So as one of my colleagues, I am also a pessimist in this respect, and I guess that it might happen. And probably neighbor countries have to to preview this kind of threat, and to develop a coordinated policy to avoid it, to show that it's actually obligation by Western countries to invest in Afghanistan. There was a program adopted by Western countries. Of course, it might be not relevant nowadays, but the program was for Afghanistan, and there were obligations to invest in Afghanistan after withdrawal. So we should probably not forget about this plan and adopt it to present realities, and try to avoid the bad scenario when Afghanistan becomes the point of disagreement and potential wars. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do have a few more questions in the chat panel, but since we're short of time, one of my colleagues, Imran Sardar, wants to ask a question verbally. I would request Imran Sardar. Imran, please, if you go ahead and ask your question, be very, very brief, please.
Thank you, Arish, for giving me this opportunity. Every state has its own set of approaches to Afghanistan, but one thing is very common, that is prevention of terrorism. So despite the differences between India and Pakistan, do you think that this is the golden opportunity for India and Pakistan, leaving their history aside and come together for the sake of regional stability? Do you think we need to work on this front at this time? Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. I would direct this question first to Dr. Salma Malik and then to Dr. Absal Ashraf. Dr. Malik, would you want to comment on whether Afghanistan provides India and Pakistan an opportunity to cooperate?
Well, actually, it should ideally, and one can only hope that it provides India and Pakistan with an opportunity to cooperate and converse. But the unfortunate reality is that the Indian leadership is in no mood to converse with Pakistan. And because they're not in a mood to converse with Pakistan, plus they have also found this an excellent opportunity to further malign Pakistan and then China on several fronts, primarily geoeconomics, plus the fact that this is a very uneasy nexus coming up. So they're going to use every opportunity to create more fissures and have a proxy war front in Afghanistan rather than cooperate and converse. But if we, again, I go back to my humanitarian assistance mantra, but if we look at Afghanistan as a brewing humanitarian crisis, also the events that have unfolded over the last month as a situation where the global dynamics are changing and they have severe repercussions for both the countries and the entire region, then this is actually an excellent opportunity for not only India, Pakistan to come together in dialogue, but also to have a combined effort to prevent the region from further catastrophe or from further problems. But realistically speaking, I don't see any of such things taking place. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Malik. Dr. Ashraf, if India is unwilling to talk to us about anything, how can we convince them to talk to us about Afghanistan? What's your opinion?
Well, I think that the question really needs to be addressed very differently. It's whether Pakistan needs to address the question itself. Now, coming back to the question that was asked before this about how do we engage with the Taliban? What sort of conditions do we set? In essence, the common interest in international relations is mutual security. And certainly for the West, and I think for all the regional countries, the primary condition should be to hold the Taliban to account, not to export violent actors, terrorist actors. And that's what they've agreed with President Trump. And I think they're sincere in their agreement. I'm not so sure that they'll be successful. What we should also remember is this whole issue started with the Al-Qaeda movement. The Al-Qaeda movement recognized Mullah Omar and the future emirate of Afghanistan as their version of Islamic State, and Mullah Omar as the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the leader of the faithful. So we have some very serious undertones already in existence, and those have to be addressed. And Pakistan, I'm very sorry to say, has to sort its own house in order. Pakistan, in my humble opinion, has engaged on a potentially disastrous policy for its own security. Forget India. India cannot inflict any danger to Pakistan to the extent to which people within Pakistan are willing and desirous of doing. Pakistan's flawed, if you like, proxy warfare using jihadi extremists in Kashmir has failed to deliver results, just as many Western proxy warfare projects, in fact, most have failed to deliver results, and most Western proxy warfare projects have had blowback, and Pakistan is experiencing the same. Now in Pakistan, not only do you have the jihadi blowback, you also have the emerging, what I call blasphemous blowback, with people engaging in the love of the Prophet ﷺ to mobilize violence against the state itself. And elements of the state, ranging from the government to the military, have exploited this. So India should be a second priority in terms of security for Pakistan. Pakistan needs to clean up these monstrous organizations that have infected its institutions. And once it does that, it can deal with India from a position of strength and say, look, we have got a policy of no use, no exploitation of proxies anywhere. And you, the Indians, must adopt the same policy. I think that would be a good first step, a strong point to negotiate with India over. And I think the Indians are very much on the back foot. As Salma Malik has explained, they are trying to cover their tracks by using disinformation and malinformation. It's the same thing is happening, I think, in the West. They're embarrassed by what's happened. But Pakistan has some very real problems. And if it doesn't sort this out, and if Afghanistan, the Taliban in Afghanistan, go in the wrong direction, which is always a possibility with the Haqqani people involved, if they haven't changed their spot sufficiently, what we will get is an inspiration of this so-called Islamic Emirate for many people in Pakistan who have been encouraged to some degree by the state to look for an Islamist alternative to the state of Pakistan. So that's where the real security threat to Pakistan lies, and it is from the extremists, not from India. India is not going to damage Pakistan despite its best wishes to the extent that people, these monstrous groups within Pakistan, can and are willing to do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Absal. Internal security challenges of Pakistan, especially resulting out of the happenings in Afghanistan, has been a concern of our institute, and we have been giving policy recommendations with regard to that to the relevant circles. But maybe we might in future have another event on those lines, and we would be happy to invite you to it. Thank you so much, everybody. We had actually convened this webinar to discuss regional approach to stability in Afghanistan. But what I've learned through the past 1.5 hours is that we have ended up having a wish list for the Afghan Taliban that they need to deliver on, such as like the the spillover of terrorism, extremism into the neighboring countries. There's also been concerns have been expressed about the non-inclusive nature of the Afghan administration, in which some of the neighboring countries with ethnic communities in Afghanistan might have reservations about. We heard from Mr. Kozulin that Russia would also want Afghanistan to curb drug trafficking. So there is a lot that is being expected from the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. But Dr. Ashraf also rightly pointed out that there have been a lot of mistakes in the past 20 years as well, misplaced priorities with regards to human rights, or as he put it, a non-hierarchical approach to human rights, in which safeguarding a human right that should have been lower in the hierarchy deprives you of a human right that is that should be in the higher category. For instance, if women are losing their lives for getting education in Afghanistan. So it's issues like these which we've also discussed. And as Dr. Salma Malik also pointed out, that we, as the immediate neighbor of Afghanistan, have the most to gain or lose with whatever developments take place in Afghanistan. And as Dr. ZAHID Shahab Ahmed also pointed out, that we need to have a regional approach, which was also emphasized in the last SCO summit. And we need to follow up on that through a ministerial dialogue so that we could come up with a consensus list of conditions for the Taliban government in Afghanistan, for them to be recognized by the regional countries, or for the regional countries to be able to develop some sort of economic or trade relations with them. With that, I would like to thank all my panelists for today, Professor Wong Shen, Mr. Kozulin, Dr. ZAHID SHAHAB Ahmed, Dr. Absal Ashraf, Dr. Salma Malik. Thank you so much for your time and enlightening us on this very important issue. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.